So, as you can probably tell, this is the Yokomo MX-4. I picked this up recently, and for a while I was trying to avoid buying anything sort of after the YZ10 because I really like the YZ10, and there are a whole bunch of different variants of the YZ10, and I figured the MX-4 would be kind of too new, if you will. But I saw one in really nice condition, and I figured, well, I should at least get one just so I could maybe play around with it and try to understand it, and maybe make it a runner. I'm not 100% sure because I got more than enough vintage runners as it is. But at the very least, it could be useful to just go over this chassis to try to help you understand what are the real differences between this and the YZ10 that sort of form the basis for this car. So a little bit on the history of the MX-4. The MX-4 came out in 1997. I believe not this exact car, but the MX-4 was the platform that Masami used to win the 1997 four-wheel drive World Championship. And sometimes there's a bit of confusion there because, let's see, where can I put this? I will put it right here. This here is the 1997 Yokomo YZ10. And so why would Yokomo have come out with a 97 evolution of the YZ10 when they used the MX-4 to win the 97 World Championship? Well, the reason for that, as I understand it, is that the 97 YZ10 was used at the world's warm-up race. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's what they did. And then I suppose they used this to maybe inspire the MX-4 a little bit. I'm not entirely sure, because when you look at the two chassis, they're actually rather different, and the only common feature between the 97 and the MX-4 is this multiple piece upper deck connected with a spring. That carries over into the MX-4, but the rest of this kind of doesn't. So there are pluses and minuses to each of the YZ10 and the MX-4 as I see it, since I've built a lot of YZ10s, and I did take apart the MX-4 a little bit. So let's sort of go over the YZ10 briefly, and then we'll get to the MX-4. So the YZ10 is, I believe, a simpler car than the MX-4, and simpler in that it's actually not as adjustable as the MX-4, not by a long shot, but it's also easier to work on. So if you wanted to get to especially the center lay shaft on the YZ10, this is relatively easy to get to, as well as the fact that the spur gears attached to a slipper hub here, so you can buy Kimbrough or Robinson spur gears and just bolt them right on. Servicing the lay shaft, replacing pulleys, all that is a much more straightforward affair on the YZ10. The downside of the YZ10 is that the front suspension geometry is basically not adjustable at all. Right? The front caster block has one mounting hole for the outer front camber link, and then the inner portion of the upper suspension arm also has one mounting position. So the front roll center and camber gain are fixed on the YZ10. As far as the shock geometry, you have two mounting holes here on the suspension arm, and then depending on what kind of shock tower you have, is basically one hole. So the 97 YZ10 is basically a taller version of the 95 YZ10 tower, both of which have one shock mounting hole. So the front shock geometry is extremely limited on the YZ10. The 94 YZ10 had, I think, two holes on the fiberglass tower, so you get a little bit more, but really not much. So if you want to change the front handling characteristics, you really had to be on your game with, using one of two shock angles, and then just picking, the right springs, the right shock oil, the right damper, or the right piston types, and then maybe fiddling around a little bit with the bump steer spacers under the ball stud on the steering link, and that was basically it. Very little adjustability on the front. The rear was not much better. The rear hub carrier had two hinge pin mounting holes, so you can mount the hub carrier in a high or low position. That would change the total amount of droop that you have, as well as changing the roll center from the hub carrier side. And then on the inner camber link side, for the 95 and 97 YZ10, you had this plate here that had a couple of holes for changing roll center and camber gain on the rear. So most of the adjustability on this car came from adjusting the rear of the car. The front was relatively fixed. And in that sense, it was actually rather similar to the RC10, the associated two-wheel drive buggy from that time. The RC10, very little adjustability on the front, practically zero. But on the rear, you had a couple of holes for camber link mounting points, and that was about it. But despite the fact that it was not a very adjustable car, the YZ10 is extremely competent on the racetrack. I have a 94 YZ10 runner and a 95 YZ10 runner, and you do a little bit of setup work, but you don't really need that much in the way of front adjustability, at least for like a hard packed dirt surface or even loose dirt. The car is just really, really, really good. So the simplicity kind of helps you in that case. Now, moving on to the MX-4, if you find that you want something more adjustable for whatever reason, this is where the MX-4 really shines. The front tower has 3 mounting holes, and then the suspension arm has 2 holes as usual. So you have a total of 6 permutations of shock angle here. Okay, and then there's a plate here, kind of like the rear plate on the YZ10. You get a front plate for the camber link mounting positions. You get a total of 4 holes here for camber gain and roll center on the front. And in addition to that, even though there's only 1 hole here for the outer link, there are 2 mounting holes for the actual hinge pin for this caster block. So you can move this up or down based on that hinge pin location. I don't fully recall if those hinge pin holes have different angles, so if it's also adjustable caster, but you do have 2 hinge pin hole mounting points on this. So the front is way more adjustable on the MX-4 than it ever was on the YZ10. Even the YZ10 Works models, some of the Works front shock towers that are on the 870C type of platform on the Works models, those had maybe 2 up to 3 camber link mounting positions on for the front, but that was about it. And it really varied from year to year. If you went from a 91 to a 92 to a 93 tower, they're completely different. So this has quite a bit more adjustability for the suspension geometry and also the steering geometry. And everything's black, it's so hard to see with the right lighting. Let's see if I can do it maybe this way. Yeah, okay, there you go. So you can see there are 2 mounting points for the inner ball stud for the steering link. Okay, and that's basically to adjust Ackerman. So the YZ10 steering rack did not have any Ackerman adjustment. It was just a straight drag link that the inner steering link would mount onto, and there was no adjustability whatsoever for Ackerman. So you get something there, and then on the rear, also very adjustable. You have 3 mounting points here on the rear shock tower. The rear towers on the YZ10s were actually pretty good. I mean, the 97 was more of a fixed design, but on the 95 and the 94 you had like 3 or 4 mounting holes. So that's about the same. And then for the actual lower part of the arm, you get 2 holes. And again with the lighting, this is so bad. Looks like 2 holes. That is 2 holes. I think on the YZ10 that was 3 holes. Nope, also 2 holes. Sorry. The Works arms had 3 holes, but anyway. And you get, a bunch of inner camera link mounting points, and again with the rear hub carrier, kind of similar to the YZ10 rear hub carrier, where you had, I believe, 2 hinge pin mounting points at the bottom, and then it's fixed at the top. So the rear is about the same in terms of adjustability, but the front was way improved. Now, what bothers me about this car is the fact that the center lace shaft is pushed way, way back here. It's basically inside the rear gearbox. Okay, so the front belt is longer and the rear belt is a lot shorter. And the way that this whole thing is assembled is that the spur gear is actually a proprietary spur gear. And the assembly for the spur gear and the slipper clutch and the pulley, the drive hub that drives the rear diff pulley, is all like this one special, well, it's a couple of parts, but it forms this special unit. So you can't buy like Robinson or Kimbrough spur gears or mount them onto here. This spur gear is specially made to mount onto this assembly here. And on top of that, I've made several videos about the YZ10 having like one-way center pulleys. This also has a one-way center pulley, so the front wheels can freewheel under braking. If you want to lock that, you can't really do that on the MX-4. On the YZ10, you have options for locking the center pulley, especially if the center pulley is the one that drives the front diff pulley. I've talked about that in a separate video. This one, the one-way bearing goes back to the rear drive pulley, which is a lot like the original Yokomo 870. And because that one-way is inside, excuse me, the assembly that forms the rear drive pulley, there's no way to, there's no simple way of trying to lock that down onto the lay shaft. So you're basically stuck with a one-way bearing somewhere in the center lay shaft. You might be able to put some kind of a spring in there to form, some kind of a lateral tension to put friction on the one-way to slow down the front one-way action, but you're still stuck with some form of a center one-way. I did buy another MX-4 as a parts car, so I can tear that down and maybe play some games with, the lay shaft assembly to see if there is a trick I can play to lock that one-way, but I'm kind of doubtful. Other than that, this does look like a pretty cool car. I assume it's quite competent and fast. The parts are maybe not quite as strong as the Yokomo parts. Like the arms seem beefy, the caster blocks, everything seems beefy. The plastics feel high quality, but these YZ10 arms are just super strong. Like they're practically impossible to break. Nothing can beat that. So these arms do have cutouts. They're a bit more like a modern arm. So you'd think they were fragile, but the plastic's actually pretty thick. So they're probably still very strong. A lot of battery mounting options, as you can see here. So you can really play around with weight distribution, front to rear, depending on how you would have mounted NiCad or nickel metal hydride batteries. A lot more room on the chassis to mount electronics for the servo, the speed control, the receiver, everything toward the front. A lot more space on the chassis. The YZ10, especially the 95 and 97, had a lot of cutouts on the chassis to give it more chassis flex, but that also reduces the surface area you have for mounting servos and receivers and all the rest of it, which makes it a real pain. Still possible, but it's a pain. So I think that kind of does it. The diffs are different. They are 33 tooth diffs, but the actual shape of the part itself is a little different, so you can't quite translate directly an MX-4 differential assembly into a YZ10 or vice versa. Also, the wheel hubs are different. Instead of having the square wheel hubs, these are like hex wheel hubs, but not modern hexes. They're like these Yokomo style mounting points onto the wheel axle, and it's a sort of a hex shape. Oh right, one thing that was cool about the MX-4 is that it came with CVDs. All the YZ10s came with universal joints. This comes with CVDs as standard, which is kind of neat. CVDs tend to last longer, I think, than universal joints, so that's good for durability or simply handling more power. So yeah, this is probably just going to sit on my shelf forever, but I figured I'd get it because it's kind of a neat car. It's kind of interesting, but the major weakness as I see it is the center lay shaft assembly and the way those pulleys are designed, and the way they put the one-way in there, and the way they designed the spur gear. If they had basically kept the YZ10 style for the center lay shaft, and they just ported this directly over into the MX-4, this would be a almost perfect car, because this is much easier to work with than this thing, which is way back there, and it's actually a more complex assembly. I don't know why they did that. Yeah, so I don't know. That's about it for now. Thanks for watching.